and Scientific Committee and this 62 annual conference of Bihar Congo Society. Sorry for delay and inconvenience for you. Now we are going to start our first session, very prestigious session of Bihar Congo Society, Dr. D.K. Bose Gold Medal award session. The chairperson of the session is myself, Dr. Gyan Bhaskar, and chairperson of this session will be Dr. Ravindra Thakur sir, Dr. S.K. Rungta sir, welcome sir, Dr. T.N. Malik sir, Dr. Pradeep Karak sir, Dr. Pradeep Karak sir is here. Sir, Pradeep Karak sir बाहर में बुलवा लीजिए तो. Dr. J. Agrawal sir, Dr. Vibhuti P. Sinha sir, Dr. Randhir Jha. So we are going to start our one presenter, non-competitive in non-competitive section, Dr. Benita Lakshmi. My request Dr. Benita to come and present your work. That is the light was bhai. Traumatic optic neuropathy, BEP, as a prognostic factor, a case report. Dr. Benita, please.
Good morning everyone. Today I am going to discuss a very important and interesting topic, namely traumatic optic neuropathy, VEP as a prognostic factor, case reports. Traumatic optic neuropathy is a condition in which acute injury to the optic nerve from direct or indirect trauma results in vision loss. It is a clinical diagnosis in patients with decreased visual acuity with RAPD in context of trauma to
Dr. Benita, Mike.
Based on mechanism of injury, it may be direct or indirect. Based on site of injury, it may be intraorbital, intracanalicular, intracranial. Based upon fundus features or location of injury, it may be optic disc trauma or avulsion, anterior optic neuropathy, posterior optic neuropathy. Since TON is a clinical diagnosis based on history of trauma, particularly head injury or vital injury, visual acuity, pupillary evaluation. Relative afferent pupillary defect is the sine qua non in cases of unilateral TON. In absence of RAPD, either there is no TON or there is bilateral TON. Fundus examination, visual fields if possible. About investigations, CT scan also shows injury to orbital contents and fracture of skull. MRI is contraindicated when a metallic foreign body is suspected. Visual evoked potential play a crucial role in diagnosis and management of TON. It is particularly useful in patients who are obtended from their initial injury, those with unreliable pupillary responses, and in cases of bilateral TON. Aim of the study to see whether VEP can be used as predictor for visual acuity recovery following traumatic optic neuropathy. We are presenting 3 cases, complete workup including CECT brain, MRI orbit, and VEP, VER, including HFA was done. Here is the details of our 3 cases. In case 1, mechanism of injury was gunshot injury of the orbit, presenting with no PL in both eye. Right eye was fixed and mid-dilated. Fundus was within normal limit. Left eye was mutilated. VEP in right eye was 1 microvolt. Amplitude was very low and latency was prolonged. Visual acuity after treatment in right eye was finger count. In case 2 and case 3, mechanism of injury was road traffic accident, particularly fall from bike. RAPD was positive in both cases. In the affected eye, fundus was within normal limit. In VEP in right eye was 6 microvolt, left eye it was 1.7 microvolt. Amplitude ratio was less than 0.5, that is 50% of the normal. Visual acuity after treatment in left eye was finger count. In case 3, VEP in right eye was 2.7 microvolt, in left eye it was 5.1 microvolt, amplitude ratio was more than 0.5, that is 50% of the normal. Visual acuity after treatment in right eye was 6/9. We used oral prednisolone 1 milligram per kg body weight for 10 days and then tapered. Studies have shown that a blow to the frontal bone is transmitted to the optic canal, that sharing force wave start Edema in closed space causing compartment syndrome that causes TON. Detection of RAPD in the presence of an intact globe in a patient with ocular or head trauma with decreased visual acuity strongly suggests TON. The most common mechanism of injury in TON include motor vehicle accidents, bike accidents, falls, and assaults. Most cases present with severe vision loss of light perception or worse. In the acute phase, the optic nerve usually appears normal. Optic nerve atrophy is often seen 3 to 6 weeks after the injury. In a study of 27 patients, 89% had a normal fundus. Optic nerve avulsions may be visualized on fundoscopy as well. Optic atrophy may develop but is only evident after 4 to 6 weeks. Many researchers have shown efficacy of oral prednisolone in cases of TON. In our cases too, vision improved in case 1 and case 3 from baseline. In case 1, a 67-year-old male presented with gunshot injury to left globe and pellet reaching into right. Visual acuity was no PL in both eyes. MRI showed intact optic nerve in right eye. Right eye VEP amplitude was very low and latency was prolonged. Patient was managed conservatively. In this case, vision improved from no PL to ambulatory vision of finger count. In case 2, a 15-year child presented with head injury after fall from bike with left eye vision of finger count and prolonged latency and low amplitude on VEP. No fracture and fundus abnormality was seen, but vision did not improve even after 4 months. In case 3, a 19-year male presented with head injury with large frontal bone fracture and lateral wall of right orbit. Visual acuity was 660 in right eye and 66 in left eye. RAPD in right eye, peripapillary hemorrhage in right eye, total suppression of visual fields in right eye. MRI showed intact optic nerve. Visual VEP revealed prolonged latency in right eye. Patient was managed conservatively medically. In this case, vision improved from 660 to 690. We can see that there is no other clue for prediction of visual acuity recovery following TON, but VEP can help in predicting the prognosis. Very low amplitude of VEP can be associated with poor visual recovery. When the VEP amplitude is within 50% of the normal side, the patient might have a favorable outcome. TON is a clinical diagnosis. VEP is useful in diagnosis, prognosis, management, and monitoring of traumatic optic neuropathy. It provides objective information about the function of the visual pathway and can help guide treatment decisions. VEP was an important prognostic factor in predicting visual recovery, even though the early clinical findings were similar in all our 3 cases. Use of VEP as the new diagnostic standard technique should be considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Binita, for nice or any.
So, Dr. Vinita, what are the immediate presenting features in TON?
In TON, the major presenting feature were relative afferent pupillary defect in the affected eye. Fundus was usually normal, and most important thing, it should not be an open globe fracture or open globe trauma to the affected eye.
Because many a time we encounter with such cases that there is sudden vision loss and there is fundus is normal.
Within normal limit, yes.
Fundus is normal and there is no change in the optic nerve head also. It becomes very difficult and there is no definite history of trauma sometimes. So what is the way to confirm whether...
Sir, first there should be a definite history of trauma to label it as a traumatic optic neuropathy. There should be relative afferent pupillary defect in the affected eye. The fundus may or may not be normal. If it is anterior optic neuropathy, the injury will be anterior to the entrance of the central retinal artery into the optic nerve. Then there will be hemorrhages, peripapillary hemorrhages. There will be optic nerve avulsion. There could be many findings. But if it is posterior optic neuropathy, then the fundus will be relatively completely normal.
What was the effect on the latency? You talked about the amplitude being less than 50%.
Yes, sir.
What was the effect on the latency?
Sir, VEP is measured bilaterally in both of the eyes using normal eye as the control, and amplitude, if it has been demonstrated that if amplitude of the VEP is within 50% of the normal eye, the patient has a favorable outcome.
So I'm asking you, what was the latency in these eyes?
Latency means, sir,
Because the latency is a more predictable factor than the amplitude, which can vary for various reasons. So I don't think you described the latency in
yes, sir, I described it. Latency was prolonged in all the cases, and VEP was low, very low. Thank you, sir. Any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Binta.
Thank you, sir.
May I request Dr. S.K. Rungta, sir, to deliver the keynote address, why to practice preventive ophthalmology. Then after we will start the competitive section. Rungta, sir. Sir, may I request Rungta, sir, to start to deliver the keynote address.
Welcome, everybody, and thanks to BOS for giving this opportunity to be here with you today. The question is, why to practice preventive ophthalmology? No financial disclosure, no conflict of interest. What I mean is, prevention is not the duty of Government of India only, but we all should try to prevent the people from diseases. We must educate our patients, community, rural masses as how not to get eye diseases, how to prevent from severity of the disease, how to prevent from complications of eye disease. The aim is to reduce blindness and visual disability. This prevention can be used at any level, international level, country level, community level, or even a general practitioner in ophthalmology may advise how to prevent from the diseases. These are the different steps: primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention. I will not go into the detail of this. These are global causes of blindness. Main chunk is cataract, and the others are childhood blindness, diabetic retinopathy, then AMD, glaucoma, and other things. These are worth screening diseases. We can do screening of these diseases or ailments: refractive errors, cataract, diabetic retinopathy, amblyopia, glaucoma, so that we can catch them in early stage. My concern is how to prevent people from diseases of Leeds and adnexa. We can very well educate the mass: do not frequently touch your eyes by hand, use hanky, no frequent splashing of water in the eyes, not to rub the eyes, and industrial workers should use protective glasses. Hope you all will agree, stye and chalagia can be prevented by educating patients for proper ocular hygiene. Likewise, dry eye disease to some extent we can prevent by proper and intermittent air conditioning. We can follow eye makeup safety tips, BAK-free formulations, and avoid unnecessary topical medication. UV exposure can contribute to cataracts, corneal damage, macular degeneration, and its association cannot be denied with pterisium, basal cell carcinoma, melanoma of the eyelids. And if you advise sunglasses, they may block most of UVA and UVB radiation. In diabetes, our country has emerged as the diabetic capital of the world, everybody knows. In 2020, nearly 31.7 million people were diabetics. By 2030, it is estimated to rise to 79.4 million, of which 3 million will be at risk of vision impairment, vision-threatening diabetic retinopathy. Sometimes you see cases with vision-threatening diabetic retinopathy, and that person even don't know that he is diabetic. So we can slow down the diabetic retinopathy and its effect by strict monitoring of blood sugar levels, strict monitoring of lipid profile, weight control, strict control of HbA1c, 30 minutes brisk walk and exercises, and we can advise to quit smoking and alcohol. Diabetic retinopathy awareness program should be initiated in all the centers. Likewise, we can slow down hypertensive retinopathy and its bad effects by proper blood pressure monitoring and regular cardiac evaluation, weight control, and monitoring of lipid profile. In glaucoma, actually, this is one of the three major causes of blindness. This is number one cause of irreversible blindness. 50% of glaucoma patients are unaware of their disease. Hence, awareness program will help in a long way. Proper use of opportunistic screening should be done. We cannot prevent glaucoma, that's okay, but we can prevent glaucoma blindness by opportunistic screening and early detection, early treatment, regular IOP control, regular follow-up, health education, avoid risk factors, alert if positive family history is there. On the other hand, screen time, the present scenario is average screen time in the world is 4.5 hours a day. It is 6.5 hours a day in India. In Singapore and Taiwan, it is 8.5 hours a day. In Brazil, Philippines, Colombia, and South Africa, it is more than 10 hours a day. You can imagine what is going to happen. As per the evidences gathered, there is definite relation between screen time and vision loss. Digital eye syndrome prevention is possible. We should rule out refractive errors or provide treatment early, proper and frequent blinking, 20-20-20 rule to follow, eyeball movements at intervals, lubricating drops, and neck exercises. With the increased screen time, it is coming in endemic form, myopia. To some extent, it can be slowed down by reducing screen time or even by intermittent use of screen devices. Let us promote outdoor games and outdoor activities, especially in kids. Amblyopia, many amblyopias can be prevented by a regular school eye checkup at an early age. It should be taken up not only in urban areas, but also in rural areas. Presently, we are not working in rural areas. Kids screening in Anganwadi centers, wear glasses regularly if advised. Additionally, the American Academy of Ophthalmology recommends that patients who are functionally monoocular due to amblyopia should help to prevent vision loss to the better eye by wearing protective glasses. ROP, increasing incidence of premature birth and so ROP. 1 out of 10 babies is born premature. Our country is at the top of the list. Out of all premature babies, 90% are survived due to intensive efforts of NICU and SNCU. The care in NICU and SNCU is so improved that 90% babies are saved. But the side effect is we get ROP. The risk factors are less than 32 weeks gestation period and less than 2 kg body weight of the baby and improper oxygen therapy. These can be prevented by quality antenatal care to prevent premature births, timely ROP screening, early management. So what we can do, rule of 30 should be followed. That is mandatory ROP screening should be done for all premature low birth weight babies within 30 days after birth. Occupational ocular injuries, especially in sports persons, building renovation, motorcycling, farmers, industrial workers, and firecrackers. Eye damage can be prevented by using protective glasses or any type of eyewear, timely intervention, proper training and education. This is also important, childhood blindness. Estimated 1.5 million blind children in the world, of whom 1 million live in Asian countries. 5 lakhs children going blind each year. That comes to 1 per minute. Of these, many can be prevented. It is estimated that childhood blindness causes 75 million blind years, number of blind into length of life, second only to cataract. So how to protect kids from the diseases? We should advise for wearing protective eyewear. Protective eyewear can prevent about 90% of eye injuries. Sunglasses that blocks 99 to 100% of UVA and UVB radiation may be recommended. we should practice, we should advise to practice good eye hygiene. We should teach our kids to wash their hands regularly, especially before touching their eyes. Also remind them to avoid rubbing their eyes. They should get enough sleep. Sleep helps your kids' eyes recover from irritants, and it is just like rebooting of this computer system. Limit screen time or intermittent use of screen. We have to educate them. Get regular eye examination. Ocular examination should be done once the infant is born, and at 6 months of age, at 3 years age, and at 5 to 6 years of age, to rule out any eye defect. They should spend time outdoors. Looking at distant objects helps our kids' eyes to recover from strain, and we should promote outdoor games. These are eye-protecting nutrients: vitamin A, E, C, omega-3 fatty acids, zinc, lutein, zeaxanthin. These nutrients have some definite role to play to keep your eyes healthy, and may probably help in preventing eyes from some ailments, though this is a big puzzle. Nearly 285 to 338 million people are estimated to be visually impaired worldwide. 90% of them live in developing countries. 80% of them are aged 50 and above. The first three causes are refractive error, cataract, and glaucoma. And fortunately, all these are preventable, curable, and avoidable. Hence, there is a definite role of prevention in ophthalmology. The leading causes of blindness globally are cataract, uncorrected refractive error, glaucoma, ARMD, diabetic retinopathy. So, future objectives should be continued improvement in the quantity and quality of cataract surgery, improvising pediatric ophthalmology in all centers, earliest refractive correction, proper use of opportunistic screening for glaucoma, and to screen known diabetics for diabetic retinopathy, especially more than 35 years of age in all centers. Introduction of topics on eye care in school curriculum, especially on preventive aspect. Children aged 6 to 14 years must be screened for any ocular ailment. These are just the definition of curable blindness, preventable blindness, and avoidable blindness is sum total of the two. The day I was inspired to practice preventive ophthalmology in my clinic, once Sri Amrit Lal Meena, the present Chief Secretary of Bihar, was our chief guest as District Magistrate Bhojpur in some blind relief camp at Ara. This is the story of 20 to 25 years back. After the event, he especially advised me to prepare a handbill to educate the masses to prevent them from eye diseases. This was his inspirational speech for me on that day, and that motivated me to practice preventive ophthalmology. Let us think why there is chaos in doctor and patient relationship. It is because of reduced chair time. We don't discuss the thing with the patients. Counseling by doctor himself or herself is becoming a rare event. Most of us not practicing preventive medicine or preventive ophthalmology. We believe in volume practice, and we are in rat race for kaun banega crorepati, kaun banega crorepati, kaun banega crorepati. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for really nice talk and informative one, and we should learn from your talk, sir. Okay. We are going to start our very prestigious Dick Bose Gold Medal, and the judges of this Dick Bose Gold Medal are Dr. Dinesh Talwar sir, Dr. Mohan Rajan sir, and Dr. Shahid Alam. My request, our first speaker, Dr. Nisha Jha. The topic of presentation is outcome of corneal collagen cross-linking in pediatric keratoconus. Dr. Nisha. May I request all the speakers to restrict to your allocated time.
A very good morning to everyone. The topic of my presentation is outcome of corneal collagen cross-linking in pediatric keratoconus. I don't have any financial disclosures or a conflict of interest. Keratoconus in pediatric age group is very common, the prevalence being 0.16%, and it occurs at a younger age. It is quite different from adult keratoconus because it exhibits a faster progression and severe visual impairment is present at the time of diagnosis. There is a greater need for keratoplasty if C3R is not done timely in these patients. So why I chose this study? Because there are very fewer studies on pediatric keratoconus to address the dilemmas associated with timing of C3R in pediatric age group and the challenges faced due to associated VKC. The purpose of my study was to study the visual outcome and topographical changes in pediatric patients who underwent collagen cross-linking at RIO IJIMS. It was a prospective study done on keratoconus patient undergoing C3R at RIO IGMS for over a period of 1 year. Written and informed consent was obtained from the parents of all the patients. The inclusion criteria was completely clear cornea with Kmax less than 60 diopters, corneal thickness more than 400 microns, children less than 18 years, and the exclusion criteria was history of previous herpetic keratitis, any central or paracentral scarring. Documented progression in my study was increase in manifest spherical refraction by more than 0.5 diopters, increase in Kmax by more than 1 diopters, and 2% or more decrease in the thinness pachymetry. Pre-operative evaluation, we looked at the slit lamp for signs of keratoconus and any VKC. Cycloplegic refraction was done. Baseline topography was done using Cirrus plus and corneal thickness measurement and specular counts were taken. And we also did a dilated fundus examination. Proper control of active VKC was done in all the patients for at least 2 weeks before proceeding with C3R. It was an OT procedure, mostly done under topical anesthesia. We did the epithelium off technique. Riboflavin 0.1% with HPMC was used, and we did the accelerated protocol. So at follow-up, at day 1, we looked for any stromal haze or infiltrate, and month 1, we calculated the demarcation line, and month 3 and 6, we checked the uncorrected visual acuity, best corrected visual acuity, and topography. Data analysis was done by SPSS statistical software. Pre and post C3R means were compared using PAIR test, and p-value less than 0.05 was significant. So coming to the results, 24 eyes of 21 patients with keratoconus were included in my study, the mean age being 12.65 years with a range of 5 to 17 years. There was a male predominance, male to female ratio was 3:1. Associated VKC was seen in around 82% patient, and 2 patients had associated Down syndrome. The VKC seen was mostly severe, mild to moderate. Severe VKC was seen in 3 patients. These are the clinical photo of a giant papilla and a case of acute hydrops with severe VKC. So coming to the pre and post C3R data of the patient, there was a increase in uncorrected, best corrected, and spherical equivalence, and no improvement of visual acuity is seen in 25% patient, and in more than 75%, at least 1 line improvement was seen. The mean value of demarcation line in my study was 263.34 microns, and it was calculated at the end of 1 month. Coming to the topographical changes, there was a flattening of Kmax from 54.30 to 53.41, and it was statistically significant in my study. This is the pre-C3R value of one of my patients. This is the post-C3R finding, and we can see there is a flattening effect in the Kmax. So there was no progression in this patient. Coming to the complication, we did not have any major complication except for 1 child with severe VKC who developed sterile infiltrate, and on starting of topical steroids, there was an improvement, and at 3 months, there was mild corneal opacity. The major challenges we faced was the late presentation, diagnostic challenges associated with VKC, faster progression, poor compliance, and limited treatment options. In recent times, the age of C3R has lowered considerably. In our study, we have done C3R in a 5-year-old child with Down syndrome and VKC. Similar reports have been published by Sapti et al. They have done C3R in a 4-year-old child. In our study, around 81% children had associated VKC, which was responsible for the more severe and faster progression. Similar results have been proved by Singhu et al. In their study. In our study, 1 eye already had advanced keratoconus with scarring and thinning, so we performed C3R in such children without waiting for any progression. And similarly, Ritu Arora et al. Have also published studies in which they have done C3R without looking for any progression. In our study, the pachymetry changes after C3R was not statistically significant because we used HPMC-based riboflavin. Use of dextran produces significant thinning and harms the endothelium, as has been seen by Hagam et al. Our study, the mean flattening of Kmax was also 0.89 diopters, which was in correspondence to other studies which have used standard protocol. So the limitation of my study was a small sample size and shorter follow-up time. What this study adds, safety and efficacy in modification of standard protocol and not waiting for progression to do C3R. So the conclusion has, C3R has an important role in halting progression in pediatric keratoconus. Early diagnosis is the key. And the take-home messages will be frequent eye rubbing. Don't take it as a red flag for keratoconus. Don't ignore eye rubbing in kids. Early diagnosis is the key. Control VKC first before proceeding with C3R, and close follow-up is needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nisa. May I request our judges to ask any question or comment?
I think it was a very, very comprehensive study. I think you have covered everything. Only thing is, have you compared AP on with AP off? There's something you can do that because
Yes,
in
sir.
children, no, we know nowadays we do AP on. So yeah, that probably you can even use a Dextran based
Yes, sir, we can do comparable.
riboflavin, but HPMC based, you feel that the endothelium. Have you done an endothelial study for this as well?
Yes, sir.
Endothelial study?
Yes, sir. The specular counts were, sir, there was not much change in the specular counts at the end of 6 months. We have calculated specular count.
Yeah, very good.
Yes, a nice study. So you have done accelerated protocol, right? So can you
Accelerated
tell us,
protocol, yes, sir.
So how an accelerated protocol is done?
Sir,
What is the difference between the standard CTR and an accelerated CTR?
So it is based on the law that the fluence, the total energy remains same. It is 5.4 megajoules per centimeter square. So we delivered it at 9 megawatts per centimeter square.
No,
At-
so what is the advantage? That's what I'm
Sir,
asking.
because these children are very small, they will not cooperate for the standard protocol. So we just wanted to do this study.
No, what is the advantage of accelerated protocol over the standard protocol?
So maybe the shorter duration time because
Yeah, so duration time is quite less.
because it is 30 minutes, yeah, because 30 minutes and we have done it in 10 minutes. So the child can cooperate for 10 minutes, but at 30 minutes it's quite difficult in pediatric age group.
Yeah, so what I'm telling is like it would be interesting to
Compare
the results of standard protocol with the accelerated protocol.
Yes.
Right. And which statistical test do you use
So
for comparison?
pair T test to compare
Okay.
the mean values, pre and post C3.
Thank you, sir. Any questions? Thank you, Dr. Nisa. Is here Dr. Dhruv Jyoti Sarkar? No. May I request Dr. Abhishek Ranjan? His presentation is outcome of tenon patch graft and corneal perforation with covering sutureless.
A very good morning to all of you. My study is outcome of tenon's patch graft and corneal perforation with overlay sutures. I have no financial interest. Corneal perforations are common corneal emergency across the globe. There are multiple management modalities are available, but most of them require an eye bank support or availability of tissue adhesive. Tenon's patch graft is a technique which is not dependent on these factors as the graft is harvested from the same eye of the patient. All the published literatures used either fibrin glue or cyanocolate glue with or without suture application. The aim of our study is to know the outcome of tenon's patch graft in corneal perforation with overlay sutures without use of any glue. This is a retrospective study done at Nalanda Medical College Hospital in Patna. The study was approved by Institutional Ethics Committee of Nalanda Medical College. 29 eyes of 29 patients were studied who were operated between March 21 to June 23. And patients who were corneal perforations of more than 2 to 6 millimeter in larger diameter, and the patients who were followed up for minimum 3 months were included in the study, while cases with active bacterial fungal keratitis were excluded. Anatomical success were assessed at minimum 3 months follow-up when a structural integrity was restored with formation of a scar in anterior chamber. Patient was clearly explained about the primary goal of the surgery is to re-establish a stable globe and natural postoperative course of the procedure and the resultant scarring, which may affect the visual acuity. The need for a secondary procedure for visual rehabilitation was also explained. Written consent were taken from all the patients. Bromidine tartrate 0.15% eye drop were instilled 5 to 10 minutes prior to the surgery to achieve vasoconstriction and lesser bleeding of the donor site intraoperatively. Peribulbar or subtenon anesthesia were given for the surgery. So first we have to debride the epithelium around the wound, and then tenon's patch graft were harvested. Tenon's patch graft is placed over the perforation site and 10-0 nylon suture were passed over the Tennant's patch graft in overlay fashion, and it is tied in infinity manner. So if the graft is large, we can take suture from other side also and make it double infinity sutures. The iris is released from the wound, and then anterior chamber is formed with air and BSS, and bandage contact lens were applied. In post-operative period, tapering course of topical steroid over 4 to 6 weeks, along with prophylactic antibiotic in initial post-operative weeks or until the BCL is removed, were given. The management of underlying disease, either in the form of oral antivirals or lubricating agents or oral immunosuppression, was continued as appropriate. Patients were followed up at post-op day 1 at 1 week, every 2 to 3 weekly till 3 months, and monthly thereafter. ASOCT was done at every visit. BCL was removed after epithelialization, and suture removal was done after a scar formation or if suture get loosened. So in the early postoperative period, graft is a little bit swollen up, then with time it get epithelialized, and then it is snugly integrated with the host cornea. Coming to the results, age of the patients range from 16 to 62 years with the mean of 41.66 years. Out of 29 cases, 17 were male and 12 were female. Most of the cases constitute resolved infective keratitis, followed by non-infective keratitis and viral keratitis. Size of corneal perforations range between 2.8 to 5.8 millimeter with a mean of 4 millimeter. Follow-up period varies between 14 to 44 weeks with mean of 29 weeks. Time of epithelialization varying between 3 to 4 weeks with a mean of 4 weeks. Time of scarring varies between 10 to 18 weeks with a mean of 14 weeks. Anatomical success were achieved in 90% of our cases, while 3 cases were failed out because of graft ectasia and flat anterior chamber with corneal scar. So coming to the discussions, Tennant's tissue produces autologous fibroblast and connective tissue, which not only provide a structural support, but also play crucial roles in reducing inflammation and accelerating wound healing. Because it is autologous, there is no risk of infection or immune reaction. It is inexpensive and readily available. So when we compare our study with the other studies which were used glues, successful restoration of the globe integrity were seen in 74 to 90% of the cases, while in our study without use of any glue, anatomical success were achieved in 90% of the cases, which were comparable to that. Time of epithelialization are also comparable with other studies. Time taken for a scar formation, that is Tennant's patch graft is integrated into the corneal tissue, were also comparable to the other published studies. Failure were seen in 13% cases in other published studies, while in our study it is seen in 10.34% of the cases. So to conclude, Tennant's patch graft is a simple and effective procedure that does not require the backup of an eye bank. It can be performed in a small to moderate sized corneal perforation which do not have active suppuration. It restores the tectonic support and reestablishes a stable ocular surface. Tennant's patch graft with overlay sutures without any glue is a very convenient and cost-effective technique with a low rate of post-operative complications, making it a viable option, especially in areas with limited resources. Its outcome is comparable to Tennant's patch graft with use of any glue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abhishek, for nice talk. May I request our judges to comment or questions?
Very, very nice study. I think very innovative because you are putting sutures. Only the concern I have is because the original studies, whatever we are also doing is with the glue. We are putting the Tennant's graft, putting the glue. It makes it very easy because it's very simple and fast surgery as well. Now you are putting sutures. You are taking sutures from the, of course, from the normal cornea, but that area is already a little thin. So you have to be a little careful in putting the sutures there, no?
So what I am doing, sir, I am taking suture from the healthy cornea,
Yeah.
and I am not touching the graft actually. Actually, it needs a little bit
Learning.
curve to keep the graft stable there
Yeah.
without touching, because once the graft will touch, it will displace from the position. So what I am doing is I am taking the sutures from the normal cornea, and I just pass the needle without touching the graft and take it the other side on the normal cornea. And I just cross the suture over that, and I place when I pass hold the suture. And then it is, I am doing it cross like suture and then tying it. If it is like it is large graft, then I am doing on the perpendicular side also. Like once I will put suture like this fashion and another like in this fashion,
This
in
way
horizontal and vertical direction to snugly fit the graft there. So that thin area I am not touching with the needle. So I am just passing the suture over it so that the graft will sit over
Any
there.
of the cases it is displaced from the original
Pardon?
site? Any graft displacement was there or any cases in the graft?
So usually, if once it is get stable on table, and if I put a BCL, then the chances of graft displacement is very less, sir.
Okay.
सर इज आस्किंग कि अगर कोई डिस्प्लेस हुआ है कि आपके स्टडी में
सर मेरे स्टडी में सर एक डिस्प्लेस हुआ था जो कि हमने फिर से उसको रिप्लेस करके और फिर से करा one case was displaced, then I will just put and I'll doing it with the double suture.
Teenon is not a impermeable thing. So, I mean, like, you didn't face, Tenons is not impermeable, no? So the chance that it may still leak despite that, the gas will prevent the initial 2-3 days while the air is there inside the AC. But subsequently, you didn't face any problem of shallow AC or the AC not forming properly.
So sir, in initial period, actually the graft imbibes the fluid and it gets swollen. So because I am putting the BCL is over there, so once it gets epithelized, then AC is formed. Yes, we got two cases in which we could not form the AC, so that may happen, sir. But in most of the cases, once air is inside and that is, then usually AC is formed and it gets epithelized.
Yeah,
So that is the limitation,
6
sir.
millimeter is very large. 6 millimeter is a very large perforation to stop with a tenon.
Sir, it
Small
works.
perforations are probably easier to stop, but with a larger perforation, I mean, have you noticed any relationship between the size of the perforation which you can handle with this graft and the, like is the smaller perforations which are better managed? Have you tried to see any limit where?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I have done only till 6 millimeters, sir. Over that, it is hard to get tectonic support from this because the graft is very pliable.
The other question is, do you feel that the scarring is more or less with this as compared to glue?
Yes, sir. Two advantage I am getting, sir. First, it is the whatever a scar is formed, it's very much circumscribed, like located to that area where I have put the graft or whatever perforation was there. And second thing is vascularization is very little compared to the glue. Whatever sinoculate glue we have put, there are a lot of vascularization, and after that, once you plan further surgeries, then it will having a problem. But with this, you will have vascularization is very less, or in a small perforation, hardly any vascularization is there.
What was the average size of perforation?
Pardon, sir?
Average size of perforation.
So it is 2 to 6 millimeter I have taken in the study, so it is around 4
So
millimeter.
how did you actually harvest it? Like, did you measure the perforation size and then did you mark that area, the tenons, like that, this thing that you showed in the video, that round circular, the graph which you have harvested. So did you pre-mark it?
Sir, initially I have started marking whatever the perforation size, I have to take a little larger graft from that size. Oversized graft we have to take because the graft shrinks over a period of the time. So initially I was started, once I got experience with how much graft I need to take, then I have harvested without measuring. The other advantage is graft is very much like we can spread the graft, so it is very much elastic. So it may be little bit size is not a big issue if you get the good size graft. If graft is oversized, then you can cut, after putting the suture, you can cut trim the edges of the graft also.
Thank you, Dr. Abhishek.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Dr. Madhulika Sinha, not here. Dr. Madhvi, no. Dr. Silpi Agrawal. Dr. Silpi, please. The topic of presentation is demographic dilemma in secondary angular glaucoma.
Good morning, respected chairperson and judges. I have no financial interest. Secondary angle closer glaucoma have a variety of underlying etiology that can be developmental or acquired. It is important to know its management due to its aggressive nature and the rapid worsening of visual function. Rare causes of secondary angle closer glaucoma like drug-induced glaucoma, systemic inflammatory disease presents unique diagnostic challenges. Misdiagnosis and mismanagement can cause rapid visual loss. Detailed history taking and imaging are crucial for diagnosing these causes. The study is to highlight the diagnostic dilemma encountered in diagnosing secondary angle closer glaucoma at Lakshmi Nethralaya Ara and to emphasize the role of advanced diagnostic technique like gonioscopy, OCT, ultrasound biomicroscopy and the clinical examination for accurate identification. The study was a retrospective observational study and the medical records were reviewed for detailed analysis of clinical presentation, diagnostic workup, treatment regime and outcome for secondary angle closer glaucoma cases between January 2022 to December 23 in Lakshmi Nethralaya Ara. The cases were enrolled according to the inclusive and exclusive criteria. The statistical study was done by pair t-test and chi-square test using SPSS software. The cohort consists of 40 eyes of 27 patients. There was a male preponderance. The most common cause of secondary angle closer were neovascular glaucoma and the lens-induced secondary angle closer, which comprises around 45% of cases, followed by the drug-induced. The baseline IOP of all these cases are very, very high. As you can see that the most of the cases presenting with a baseline IOP of more than 35 mm of Hg, which is significantly reduced after the treatment. 65% of cases were visual acuity of less than 624 to CF. The visual acuity showed statistically significant improvement after the treatment. The lens-induced patients respond very well with the surgical management and the neovascular secondary angle closer respond with the multifactorial treatment. Now I'm going to discuss and highlight to overcome the diagnostic dilemma in a couple of my cases. A 40-year-old hypertensive patient complained with the decreased vision and pain since 2 days. His base corrected visual acuity with -4 diopter sphere is 6.9 in both the eyes. Intraocular pressure was 36 in the right eye and 38 in the left eye. Gonioscopy revealed closed angle. The ASOCT showed forward shifting of the lens iris diagram and the ultrasound biomicroscopy showed shallow peripheral CDs. With the history and the clinical finding discussed, I come to the conclusion that there is an acute myopic shift and secondary angle closer due to his antihypertensive medication, chlorthalidone. The patient was advised to stop the treatment and within 7 days, the patient condition improved drastically. This is the patient fundus photograph, which is absolutely normal, fundus and the OCT findings. In my second case, a lady of 30 years old presented with the progressive visual loss from last 10 days and have occasional headaches. This lady has a depigmentation of skin from past 1 year. The best corrected visual acuity in the right eye is 618 partial and left eye is 6.6. The anterior chamber showed shallow anterior chamber. The intraocular pressure was 40 mm of Hg in the right eye and 38 mm of Hg in the left eye. The fundus showed the hyperemic blood margin of the disc. The macula shows the serous retinal detachment, which is very well improved after the treatment. The left eye also having the similar finding of blood disc margin and the hyperemic disc with the minimal SRF in the macular area. So with this, I come to the diagnosis of Vogt-Koyanagi-Harada syndrome. The patient was well responded with the high dose of methylprednisolone for 3 days, followed by the slow tapering of prednisolone. Why I took this case? Because in primary angle closer glaucoma, once the disease is diagnosed and the treatment is done, the cases will resolve very quickly and giving a good prognosis. But in all secondary angle closer, because of its aggressive nature of the disease and even in the presentation, the visual acuity is low and the IOP, baseline IOP is very high, the chances of loss of eye is very high, and within a couple of months, the patient may lose his vision. The study is limited by its retrospective design and a small sample size, relative short follow-up period, which may affect the generalizability of the finding. This case series emphasizes the importance of the detailed patient history and the clinical and the imaging workup in diagnosis secondary angle closure. Recommended diagnostic approach are gonioscopy, OCT, and the uvea. The early detection and the timely intervention is essential. The tailored management based on the underlying cause is crucial for preventing the permanent damage which is usually happen within a month. Our study is comparable with the study done in the All India Institute, which shows the male preponderance and the similar prognostic outcomes. Thank you.
Congratulations, Dr. Silpi. Well presented. May I request judges for any question or comment?
Both the cases, it was aqueous misdirection syndrome, no? Because of drug. Aqueous misdirection syndrome. The AC was shallow, something like malignant glaucoma. The AC was shallow and there was an aqueous misdirection. Because of that, only the pressure went up.
The first case is, sir,
First case was because
is like a anterior bowing of the ciliary process, ciliary
yeah,
body.
did we put the patients on atropine?
No, that patient is on chlorthalidone and
No.
the treatment I have given.
Topical
Atropine I have given after.
Because you did not mention that, that's why I'm asking.
No, it's the cycloplegic is given in there, sir.
Okay. Yeah, more than cycloplegic, the atropine. Of course,
Okay.
cycloplegic you can put cyclopent also, but atropine is the one
Yeah.
which works because there is a forward rotation of the ciliary process in these patients. And once you put atropine, it will pull it back.
Yeah.
Yes. So both the patients, I think, put them on atropine.
No, the first patient
First
I put on
patient.
the atropine. The second patient is I diagnosed as a Vogt-Koyanagi-Harada syndrome. So patient was on high dose of with methylprednisolone followed by the oral steroids, slow tapering of oral steroids.
The second patient also had a shallow AC, no?
Yes, hello, his.
That's what I'm asking. Okay.
So, since you didn't need to do a PI, so obviously this is not the misdirection, it's more of a misdirection because of the ciliary process's rotation. It's like a form of a malignant glaucoma rather than a classic angle closure glaucoma. What you're talking of as secondary angle closure glaucoma, it's more it's not a pupillary block.
Yeah, it's not a pupillary.
It's basically a misdirection of the aqueous because of a rotation of the ciliary body. So the management is unlike that of a conventional angle closure. That's the important thing here, I think. So the diagnosis is important from that point of view.
What I learned, I really don't go towards the aqueous misdirection. What I feel is all because of the chlorthalidone or the topiramate. These all drugs will causes the shallow CDs and the anterior rotation of the ciliary body.
That's what causes the aqueous.
That was, but
The aqueous misdirection produces, because of the forward rotation, the aqueous misdirection occurs, and because of that you have the CDs as well.
okay.
Yes. So that is why the management is not a PI, otherwise the management.
Otherwise, the management is the etiology is not the pupillary block.
Good.
Thanks.
Yeah, so as you said, like this drug-induced secondary angle closure is quite interesting, and I do agree that forward bowing of the iris, it can cause a secondary angle closure. So more than chlorthalidone that you have mentioned, there are other drugs which are more likely to cause angle closure. So what are those drugs which are commonly used?
That topiramate is most commonly we see causing
So
the angle
SSRIs,
closure.
SSRIs and tricyclic antidepressants.
Tricyclic antidepressant and
Yeah.
the sulfur drug also causes the secondary angle closure due to drug induced.
Okay.
Sulfamates are also causes. But
Yeah, so we reported a case of patient using aripiprazole, which is also an antipsychotic, and he developed, it also causes transient myopia in these patients.
yeah, this
Transient
patient also
myopia.
having a -4 diopter
Yeah, so
myopic
that
shift.
myopia also improves when the drug has been stopped, yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My topic for today is demographic profile and clinical aspect of Stevens-Johnson syndrome, a retrospective study. I have no financial interest and no conflict of interest. Stevens-Johnson syndrome is an immune-mediated reaction resulting in widespread sloughing of skin and mucosal surfaces. The most serious ocular, long-term sequelae being ocular, that may be blinding, and 90% of the survivors experience chronic ocular surface disease. The aim of this study is to study the features of acute and chronic ocular manifestation of SJS and to highlight its importance in the timely management and to find out the effect of demographic profile of SJS on the severity of visual impairment. The study was conducted in RIU IGMS Patna. It's a retrospective observational study carried out by reviewing the medical records of all the patients from 2019 onwards. It was an institute ethical clearance was taken. In patients who followed the following on the basis of medical history and clinical examination had certain features, and having scored more than 5 were included in the study, and having scored less than 5 were excluded from this study. Patient workup included a detailed medical history, a demographic profile including age, sex, socioeconomic status, detailed ocular examination including visual acuity, detailed examination with fluorescence staining, and fundus examination if possible, and investigation was done if the patient was compatible with it. SPSS statistical software was used for statistical analysis. Coming to the results, the mean age at the onset in our cohort was 18.4 years, while the mean age at presentation was 24. That means there was a 6-year gap between the mean age at onset of SJS and presentation to us. Male-female ratio was almost equal. The most common inciting agent found in our study was antibiotics, 24%, followed by nimesulide. Coming to the socioeconomic status according to the Kupuswamy scale, about 60% of the patients belong to the lower middle, upper lower and lower socioeconomic status, and 15 patients were from rural and remote areas with poor access to healthcare and emergency services. On the basis of time of presentation, there were 5 patients who presented to us in the acute phase and 35 patients who presented to us in the chronic stage, with a mean time of presentation of 4.2 days and 18.5 months respectively. Now let's take both of them one by one. Coming to the acute, the most common symptom was pain, photophobia, redness and lacrimation, and the most common sign was membranous conjunctivitis, lid excoriation, corneal epithelial defect, and inflammatory membrane that was seen in almost 100% of our patients because 100% of them were of severe grade. The main pillar of management in this case was amniotic membrane transplantation. That was done in all the 5 patients presenting to us in the acute stage along with topical and systemic steroid. This is a case of acute stage of SJS who was treated with amniotic membrane transplantation and showed a visual acuity of 6/6 in 2 months follow-up. Now patient presented to us in the late, that is a chronic stage, that is 35 patient. On the basis of their medical history and available documents, we found that there were no patients who were consulted by ophthalmologists on the day 1. And there were 8 patients who were consulted after the day 1 but before day 7. And 27 patients whose first ophthalmic consultation was after the discharge, with a median duration of hospital stay being 22 days. Among those 8 patients, all of them were kept only on lubricating drops. The most common symptom the patient presented with was diminished vision, and the most common sign was 100% of them had lid keratinization, symblepharon, trichiasis, dystichiasis, severe dry eye, LSCD, meibomian gland dysfunction, and approximately 13.7% of the patient had complete ocular surface keratinization. Management was done on the basis of the features the patient presented with. 90% of the patient underwent mucous membrane grafting. SLET was done in 12.5% of the patient. AMT was done in 5%. Intraopian, ectropian correction and TPG was also done. Scleral contact lens trial was done in almost all the patients for visual rehabilitation. Other surgeries like tarsography, TPK was also done, and 1 patient was referred for osteodontokeratoprosthesis. Now, considering the timely and appropriate management in the acute phase, the best corrected visual acuity improved significantly. As we can see, the mean best corrected visual acuity at presentation and last follow-up is very much better in case of acute as compared to chronic, because the best corrected visual acuity in the chronic state did not show much improvement even after managing them. Coming to the discussion, in a study conducted by Jabor et al., it was seen that the significant proportion of the patient developed SJS in childhood, while the mean age in our study was 18.4 years at the time of onset of the disease. The most common inciting agent in our study was antibiotic, that was similar to the study conducted by Pasara and Jabor et al. Socioeconomic status is a very important factor when access to healthcare and emergency care is considered. Approximately 15% of the patients were for rural and remote areas with poor access to health services and leading to either homestay or treatment in either PHC or CHC. Study conducted by Seke et al. And Barnett et al. Showed that the distance and travel time are important consideration from rural and remote resident when assessing healthcare services is considered. The limitation of my study is a small sample size and unequal distribution of patient in acute and chronic stage. Concluding, we can say that SJS has a devastating ocular sequelae, and an early ophthalmic consultation is a must in acute phase. Timely AMT can help restore useful vision in these patients, and patient presenting late, usually even though we do any surgery, the vision does not restore much. Take home message is SJS has a great impact on quality of life of the survivors, and it is a responsibility of dermatologist or treating physician of the patient to seek an early ophthalmic consultation. Healthcare workers posted in peripheral healthcare center must be vigilant enough to identify a case of SJS and refer them accordingly. These are my references. Thank you.
Congratulations, Dr. Surbi, for a nice presentation. May I request our judges to comment or questions.
I think it's a good overview of the SJS. So, when do you do this AMT in the acute phase?
Sir, in the acute phase, as early as the patient presents to us, it is better we do it within 7 days. If the patient is compatible, if the patient can be taken up for surgery, then it is better if we do it within 1 or 2 days. Usually the first AMT, it might fail. Then the repeat AMT can be done in the next week, a week later.
I think the first few days, as soon as the patient presents with the
Yes.
Steven Johnson's, it's important to make sure that you release all the fornices and making sure, mechanically.
Yes, sir.
And also put them on topical steroids and lubricants and other things. I think that is very, very important. I think you have covered that very well. And the long term, the slit is working very well if it's not, if it's only unilateral, not bilateral. And or the Comet, which is there, which has been advocated by many, or even the buccal mucous membrane graft.
Yes, sir.
We are doing that as well. The long term, they are, but I think you have covered all the aspects very nicely.
I think your chronic patients were all more severe, isn't it? Because they were all admitted. The patients who came to you in the acute phase were patients who presented to the ophthalmic OPD.
Yes, sir.
Whereas patients who came in the chronic phase were patients who were actually admitted at the initial time of presentation.
So they were admitted, but ophthalmic consultation was done only in 8 patients, sir.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that the condition was also more severe. The systemic condition was more severe because they were admitted for a systemic condition, not for an eye condition.
Yes, sir.
So all your chronic patients were actually patients who were admitted for some systemic condition. So did the systemic condition prevent their ophthalmic management?
Sir, actually, the patients who are admitted in the acute phase here, because SJS is a life-threatening condition. So usually the ophthalmic part is neglected. Most of the time, if the patient is admitted in some private, most of the patients are admitted in some private hospital or in CHCs, somewhere where they are getting an ICU care. But because only 8 patients got an first ophthalmic visit in the first 7 days, and that too they were kept only on lubricating drops. That means they were not treated properly at that time. They should be treated at least steroids should be given, or they should be treated not only with the lubricating drops. Some proper management should be done. And rest of the patients were there who were not consulted by an ophthalmologist in the acute phase. So that early ophthalmic consultation is a must, because later they will come with a very deteriorated condition, and even if we manage them, nothing is going to change much.
You Dr. Surbi, right? Dr. Surbi.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, extremely challenging condition, and as an oculoplastic surgeon, I am involved in like management of most of these cases. And the sad thing is, most of these patients, they require multiple surgeries. Then there is economic burden, like when they are managed in private setups, and the results and outcomes are not that great. So one thing like which we have not explored, and it's not being used that commonly, that and I wanted to ask you, like, was oral steroid used in acute stage in any of these cases? Oral steroid,
Yes,
because
sir,
it's a systemic
steroid was
condition.
used. Systemic steroid, depending upon the treating, whether the patient were admitted in the ICU or whether they were admitted. We consulted whether oral or IV steroids can be used or not. Were given pulse therapy, but not all. Topical therapy we did steroid.
So did you notice any difference in these patients as compared to those who were not given steroids?
Systemic, sir.
Yeah. Or the patients which you took for AMT, was systemic steroids used on those patients where
So
you
systemic steroid was given in the
was given?
Yes.
So what difference did it make? Did it make any difference in those patients?
Sir, we had only 5 patients in the
So it's
acute
difficult
stage,
to
and
comment
it is
upon,
difficult
yeah.
to, find any difference.
Yeah, so no, what I suggest, like it would be interesting to to see the effect of oral steroids even in these patients if they are presenting in subacute stage.
Yes.
So where they are fit for being prescribed. Yeah.
Yes, pulse therapy.
So but it's not that being tried that much. It's not being explored that much, not being tried that much. Yeah, because I give intradermal steroids to many of these patients, lid to the lid, because the lid is quite thickened,
Yes.
which causes entropion. So I routinely give intradermal steroids, 1 or 2 series, which thins out the lid and actually corrects entropion without any surgery in some of these cases. Okay, thanks.
Dr. Ranjit Kumar is here. Dr. Ranjit, please. ये दोनों पे हो सकता है ना वगैरह. हाँ, डॉक्टर रंजित. Next, please be ready, Dr. Manish Kant and Dr. Priti Sinha.
Good morning, everyone. I am presenting a case of conjunctival rhinosporosis. You know that rhinosporosis is a chronic localized infection of the mucous membrane. It may infect the mucous membrane of the nose, nasopharynx, eye, skin, and genitalia. Ocular involvement is seen in 15% cases. Among ocular involvement, which is of 15%, conjunctiva is the commonest site. Now the case description. Here is the case of 67-year female from the Rohtas district of the Bihar. Comes with the complaint of foreign body right eye paleness mass for 6 months with foreign body sensation, redness, and watering right eye. This is the mass growth is of gradual in onset. There is no bleeding or discharge from the mass, and she has no history of any ocular trauma. Past history, she is HIV positive and on the antiretroviral therapy. There is history of right eye cataract surgery 1 year back, and personal history and family history non-significant. Systemic examination, there is no abnormality detected. Now the ocular examination. The right eye, the best corrected vision 6/6 and left eye 160. The intraocular pressure within normal limits. Lid adnexa, there is no abnormality detected. Extraocular movement full and free, both eye. In the right eye, we can see there is a pedunculated lesion on lower palpebral conjunctiva near the medial canthus and the caruncle. This is the mass from rages from the medial canthus and the caruncle, and we will see in detail in next slide. Left eye conjunctiva normal, both eye cornea clear, is both eye AC normal depth, right eye pseudophakic, and left eye NS3 plus PSC cataract. Right eye fundus is normal, left eye hazy due to the cataractus lens. So we here see there is a this right eye, there is a pedunculated lesion near the medial canthus. The size is approximately 1 centimeter to 1 centimeter. This is the papillaform surface with the vascular tuft, and there is a epithelial ulceration on the top of the mass. There was no discharge and conjunctiva was congested. This mass is not attached to the lid, but it arises from the medial canthus and the inner margin of the caruncle. Now we made the DD of conjunctival rhinosporosis, squamous papilloma, squamous adenoma, lacrimal sac diverticulum, recurrent chalazion, and chronic follicular conjunctivitis in contact lens wearer. This patient we initially put on the antibiotic eye ointment and lubricant for 2 weeks, and we have sent the blood investigation. Then we planned the excision biopsy under the local anesthesia. The mass was completely excised with cautery at the base of the lesion. The base was sutured with 6-0 Fickrell suture and mass sent for the histopathological examination. We can see in the next slide there is a histopathological section of the tissue. We see that there is a trophozoite, and outer layer is lined by the squamous and stratified squamous epithelium. And here we see there is a thick wall sporangium and basophilic sporangiosperm endosperm is here. And this is the lining of the squamous epithelium. So definitive diagnosis of ocular rhinosporosis was made. ENT consultation said to rule out any other mucosal surface rhinosporosis. Post-operatively, oral antibiotic eye drop, and lubricants prescribed. and postoperatively dapsone 100 milligram twice daily for the 3 months given. We can see post-op day 1 picture. There is a healthy mass and there is vicule suture. On 7th day, the excised pedicle healthy and suture is also intact. So we see now the discussion. Rhinosporidiasis is a rare chronic granulomatous infection of the mucous membrane caused by the Rhinosporidium sebarii. It is classified under the Mesomycetostoma of aquatic protozoan parasite of the fish and amphibia. This parasite mainly in the hot and tropical climate because it needs that humid condition to the grow, and mainly it is seen in India, Nepal, East Africa and America. The nose and nasopharynx is most commonly involved. 70% of the cases we have see there is a nasal rhinosporidiasis. Ocular in manifestation is of 15%. The most common ocular site of infection is conjunctiva, followed by the lacrimal sac. There are 2 types of conjunctival rhinosporidiasis, the surface based on the surface or lesion, that is of flat type and a pedunculated type. Definitive management includes the surgical excision along with the cauterization of the base of the lesion. Recurrence are rare. Postoperative dapsone therapy arrests maturation of the spore and promotes the fibrosis in the stroma. So we have described dapsone in this case. Also, the study Mukherjee et al. Reported a case of conjunctival rhinosporidiasis in a 25-year-old male from the rural background. Thakur, SKD et al. Reported a case series of 5 patients with ocular rhinosporidiasis with Eastern Nepal. The conjunctiva was involved in 2 patients and the lacrimal sac was involved in 3 patients. These are the references. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ranjit, for nice case presentation.
The typical size, there is the mass or lesion, it is of papilliform surface and yellowish. Yes, sir. Yes. Yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Next is Dr. Priti Sinha. Dr. Manish is not here. Dr. Priti Sinha.
Good morning, everyone. My title of the presentation is Outcomes of Primary Orbital Implant in Evisceration at a Tertiary Care Center. I have no financial interest and no conflict of interest. Ocular destructive procedures, as we all know, is a nightmare for both ophthalmologist as well as patient. Yet it is routinely performed, sometimes to remove an already auto-eviscerated eye, sometimes to protect the contralateral eye, and sometimes to prevent the intracranial spread of infection. A study has revealed that the prevalence is about 0.15% in India. However, the biggest concern that arises after surgery is of cosmesis, and it affects not only the young people but also the older individuals. So this study aims to evaluate the outcomes on evisceration with orbital implant in terms of implant extrusion as a marker of success. It was a retrospective study done in 84 eyes who underwent evisceration between July 23 to July 24 at RIO. On the basis of timing and etiology, 3 groups were formed, in which group 1 included emergency evisceration without implant, group 2 were eyes with implant, and group 3 were planned evisceration. In all the cases, axial length of the fellow eye was taken in the planned evisceration cases with A scan, and all the patients underwent the same basic evisceration technique. However, in the cases of planned evisceration, they underwent 4-petal evisceration surgery with implant insertion, and then the conformer was placed in all the cases. Follow-up was done at day 7 and day 21, and at month 2 the conformer was removed and the dressing was done with reinsertion of conformer. At month 3 the prosthetic cell was implanted, and those who were willing for the customized prosthesis were processed for the same. A statistical analysis was done using SPSS software, and the p-value less than 0.05 were considered significant. In this study, group 1 were eyes without implant, and it included about 10 patients, out of which 3 were auto-eviscerated and 3 were traumatic globe perforation. In group 2 were 58 eyes, and 16 cases were of planned evisceration. Out of 10 were painful blind eye and 6 were phthisis bulbi. In this study, the mean age was about 55.9 years, with the age ranging from 6 to 89 years. However, the gender ratio and the laterality was not significant. Implant extrusion was observed in 5 cases of group 2 and 2 cases of group 3. In the R study, the most common cause was found to be endophthalmitis for evisceration, and out of which 22% underwent implant extrusion, which was statistically significant. Now, over the decades, evisceration has always been preferred over enucleation, as it is less disruptive to the tissues and thus providing better motility. However, the implant extrusion has remained a frequent complication, for which endophthalmitis has been considered a significant risk factor. In our study also, the most common cause for evisceration was of infectious origin, and same supported by Tanuj Dada et al. In this study, the extrusion rate in endophthalmitis was 22%, which was statistically significant, consistent with previous studies. In this study, we found that the cases who underwent evisceration without implant were cosmetically dissatisfied, and they were later planned for socket reconstruction with orbital implant. In group 2, 5 cases of extrusion occur, which can be explained due to presence of unhealthy tissues and improper implant size. And in group 2 cases where extrusion occurred because of the phthical eye with contracted socket, and they later underwent socket expansion with a smaller implant size. These are some of the pictures. Many authors suggest that there should be no primary implantation in endophthalmitis, and it should be performed later on as a secondary procedure. But this causes prolonged hospitalization and need for second surgeries. But the newer studies has revealed that there is low complication and good implant retention even with primary implant placement. The limitations in this study was that the axial length of the fellow eye was not considered in emergency cases, and so the size and the type of implant and the longer follow-ups would have yielded better statistic on outcomes. Coming to conclusion, placing an orbital implant always yields better results, and it avoids the need for second surgery and thus is more cost effective. Proper wound care and hygiene is of utmost importance, as it prevents wound dehiscence and thus the risk of implant exposure or extrusion. So ocular destructive procedures always leave a huge burden on patient physiologically and psychologically. So we as an ophthalmologist should not only offer treatment but also psychological management. Orbital implant with proper size and wound care should always be tried in all cases so that proper cosmesis could be achieved. These are some of the references. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Preeti. Any question from our experts?
I can listen, sir.
Yeah. So was optic nerve head also excised?
No, sir, in our study, we
no,
have
it
not
was
excised.
placed within the sclera.
Yes, sir, within the sclera.
Okay.
What is the type of the implant you put?
In our study,
Yeah,
sir, we have done with PMMA implant only, sir.
PMMA.
Yes, sir.
No, whether you are using Medport, anybody is using Medport
Yes, sir,
implant?
we have not used, as most of the patients that come to our center are not that much
Yeah.
it's costly, sir. So we use.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Dr. Preeti. May I request Dr. Neha Kumari, pattern of eyelid injury and management outcomes in a tertiary care center. Dr. Neha, please.
Good morning, everyone. My topic is pattern of eyelid injury and management outcome in a tertiary care center. I have nil financial interest with non-conflict of interest. Consent from subjects were taken for use of photograph and videograph. Eyelid act as a curtain for eyes that often get injured both in open and closed lobe injury, as it is not only protective covering but also has some important functions such as it aids in light reaching the eye, tear film distribution and drainage. Eyelid injury, when not properly managed, can lead to various complications like entropion, ectropion, and ptosis. Thus, eyelid repair is not only important for cosmesis, but for preservation of its function also. My objectives were to evaluate the etiological and accompanying clinical factors in eyelid laceration and to study the outcome of lid injury repair. It was a retrospective study done at RIO IGIMS with a patient with lid injury without orbit involvement or open globe injury, and the study duration was of 18 months from Jan 23 to June 24, and follow-up period was of 6 months. Eyelid injury without tissue loss was primarily closed with interrupted sutures, Caniculi was repaired using Vasofix as shown in video 1, and lead margin and tarsal were repaired as seen in video 2. We can also see a female left below with human bite with tissue loss repaired with tangential flap and severely lacerated eyelid primarily repaired with excellent outcomes with minimal sequela. From January 2023 to December 2023, 291 patients were surgically managed at our Center for Eye Trauma. Out of these 291 patients, 36 patients were of isolated lead injury and were selected for our study. The male-female ratio was 3:1 and the mean age was 27.18 years. As we can see in a chart, the main etiology was fall. There were 3 groups in my study. Group A, the patient presented within 24 hours. In Group B, the patient presented between 24 to 48 hours. And in Group C, the patient presented after 48 hours. Now coming to injury type, 22.2% patient had caniculi involvement, with half of them had canthal tendon avulsion, 13.9% had tissue loss. Maximum patient, that is 47.2%, presented within 24 to 48 hours. The intervention in maximum patient, that is 86.11 patient, was done within 24 hours of presentation. Now coming to Group A details, only 6 out of 36 patients presented to us within 24 hours, and all of them were repaired under 24 hours. Now coming to Group B, 17 patients presented within 24 to 48 hours. The surgery was done in all patients within 24 hours in all patients. Now coming to Group C, 8 patients out of total 13 presented after 48 hours underwent primary repair. 2 patients of RTA developed cellulitis and were primarily medically managed after resolution of edema. Proper surgery was done. Similarly, in 3 patients, 2 of animal bite and 1 of human bite were given proper anti-rabies immunization, then underwent secondary repair for cosmesis. The most common associated ocular complication was hypema, that was found in 30.6%. The most common post-op complication was watering. Further, when the causing of watering was investigated, meibomian gland disease was found to be most common cause. 2 had blocked caniculi and 1 had caniculi repair failure. All complications were managed appropriately. Now coming to association of post-op sequelae with time of presentation, as we can see 1 patient among 6, that is 16.7% in Group A, 4 out of 17, that is 23.5% in Group B, and 5 out of 13, that is 38.5% in Group C developed complications. Discussion. Consistent with other studies, injury were most common in adolescent and middle-aged men. The most common etiology was in our study was fall, similar to a study conducted by Aviditi et al. While in Nepal, RTA was the leading cause. It can be due to, we have excluded the patient with globe involvement, open globe injury and orbital involvement. In Turkey, trauma by sharp objects was the most common. In our study, direct flap closure was done in 30 patients and lower caniculi repair was done in 16.7%. In our study, most common complication was watering, and second surgery was required in 13.9% for post-op sequelae. Now coming to conclusion, we should aim for early, fine and meticulous repair, that is key to surgery, and to achieve best functional and cosmetic outcome. Undue delay or inappropriate treatment can delay healing, leading to infection and fibrosis. Complication, though not life-threatening but may become life-devastating, complication can be managed by second surgery. My limitation was it was a single-center study with a small sample size and brief study period. Now take-home message, it is crucial to provide preventive advice and implement safety measures in workplaces. Mothers should be educated to replace hook with button to avoid blouse-hook injury in small children. Firecracker injury is preventable by using proper safety measures. These are my references. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Neha. Any comments or question from judges?
The animal bites, give the rabies vaccine for these patients.
Sir, as I have said, sir, in animal bite, and there was also one case of human bite, we have taken proper anti-rabies precautions. And after when the tissue was healed with secondary granulation, we did surgery for cosmesis purpose only and nothing else. Otherwise, surgery would be delayed for 6 months, can be delayed for 6 months.
Nice study, Dr. Neha. Thanks.
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Manish Khan is here? No. Now end up this our competitive section, and now we are going to start our non-competitive section. Dr. Sonali Prasad, please. The topic of presentation, role of insulin in nootropic ulcer. Dr. Sonali, please.
A very good morning, everyone. Thank you, Boscan, for giving me this opportunity. Today, I'm going to talk about topical insulin and its utilization in ocular surface disorders. So before that, I want to thank my alma mater, Sadhguru Netha Chikitsale, who has not just given me surgical and academic knowledge, but have also given me opportunity to do some good clinical research work. So, going deep into what is ocular surface, we must first know what is a limbal niche. So we already know that cornea is a very important surface, and it maintains the corneal transparency and also acts as a barrier. But what is important for the regeneration of the cornea are the limbal epithelial stem cells. These limbal epithelial stem cells are present in a microenvironment. These microenvironments are only known as limbal niche. The limbal niche nurtures the limbal epithelial stem cells with the help of melanocytes, keratocytes, Langerhans cells, and other cells. These limbal niche are present in the limbus, which has an anatomical structure, the palisades of Vogt. These palisades of Vogt act as a connection between the limbal epithelial stem cells and all the unique cells. So the limbal epithelial stems, it regenerates, transfers into transient amplification cells, postmitotic cells, and then the corneal epithelial differentiation cells. If any hampering in the limbal epithelial stems, the degeneration or the decrease in the epithelialization starts, and that can hamper the corneal hemostasis. Diseases like dry eye disease, diabetic keratopathy, neurotrophic keratopathy all hamper the corneal hemostasis and later on lead to epithelial defects. So any persistent epithelial defect can happen because of the failure of the corneal protective mechanism, decrease in the tear film integrity, any problem in the corneal innervations or epithelial regenerative sensor, or if there is a disbalance between the molecular factors like the cytokines, enzymes, and the adhesive molecules. So we already know diabetic retinopathy is a very grievous disease, but diabetic keratopathy is the most common thing that happens in a diabetic patient. This happens because of the glycation products and also the increase of the hyperglycemia induced mitochondrial production of superoxide. These in turn leads to inflammation and the microvascular damage, leading to altering in the immune response. So particularly talking about neurotrophic keratopathy, it is a rare disease and it is caused by the corneal nerve alterations, and that is because of the impairment in the sensory and the tropic functions. So pathogenesis here lies the impairment of the trigeminal nerve. But we have learned in the past that despite the standard treatments like aggressive lubrication, therapeutic contact lens, amniotic membrane or tarsorrhaphy, still the neurotropic ulcers or the ocular surface disorder can progress into neovascularization and ultimately ocular perforation. So insulin has come as a newer technique and to maintain the ocular surface and the tear composition, and has been gaining advances in the regenerative medicine field. So insulin, it is already present in the healthy lacrimal gland, and it has two basic pathophysiologies. It acts on the REF-KTP pathway, which leads to proliferation, differentiation, and migration of the cells. The other pathway, it acts on the PI3K, which is an anti-apoptotic pathway. So as I said, it is already present in the healthy lacrimal glands. So in 1921, it was a revolutionary phase when the insulin was first discovered and used for the treatment of diabetes. But it was only until 1945 that it was used for the treatment of corneal ulcer, and later on the advances in use of insulin continued with the use in healing the diabetic mellitus patient, then epithelial defect after vitreoretinal surgeries, topical insulin in neurotropic keratopathy, and so forth. In diabetic keratopathy, it has shown some good results. Dry eye disease and neurotropic keratitis, some studies have claimed 90% reepithelialization rates as well. So taking inspiration from these studies, I tried to study the role of topical insulin in neurotropic keratopathy at SNC Chitrakoot. So we did a prospective interventional double-arm study. Primary outcome was the time taken for reepithelialization, and secondary outcome was the vision gained in these patients. So neurotropic keratopathy who were not responding to the treatment, standard treatment including lubricant, antiviral, punctal plug, therapeutic contact lens were taken into the inclusion criteria, and we tried to promote use of the insulin non-invasively before going into tarsorrhaphy, before going into a surgical intervention. So these patients were divided into two groups. Group A was non-insulin and group B was the insulin group. And we also categorized, so this is a very unique part of our study where we have staged the neurotropic keratopathy into 3 stages. The third was the one where there was severe stromal involvement. So diagnosis was basically done on history taking and corneal sensation and absence of any no response to any standard treatment, and patients who had infective etiology were removed from the study. So we took an informed consent, we did a complete ophthalmological examination, proper corneal sensitivity was taken. And I want to throw some light how we prepared the insulin. So we used the rapid acting Humalog, and we constituted 1 unit fast acting insulin per 1 ml of artificial teardrops. We tried to preserve it at 2 degrees Celsius, and the patients were given at QID dose up till there was complete epithelialization in the patients. So follow-up was done on day 1, 2, 3, and then weekly till 1 month and monthly till 3 months. So we tried to analyze by QQ plot the data distribution, and outcome measures were done with independent sample t-test. So these are some of the case reports. This was the first case that we treated with insulin, and we can see in just 1.5 days, this was a diabetic patient, and there were diabetic keratopathy in this patient. So he was not responding to excessive lubrication antibiotics for even for 5 months, and then he resolved in just 1.5 days. This is another case where it was a chemical injury patient. The patient had already gone symblepharon release, foreign body removal for 1 month, and excessive lubrication was done, still no improvement, and the patient resolved and had half of the NK3, mark me, NK3 stromal lysis was also present, and these are the poor prognosis cases. So after 1 week, there was significant improvement. This is another case where it was a viral keratitis, and we wanted to start steroids in this patient, but still because of the large epithelial defect, we could not, and it just 3 days we can see it has reduced to half, and just 1 week reduced to again. It had improved significantly, and this patient was later on continued with steroid therapy. This is another case of viral keratitis, complete epithelialization after 1 week. So we treated around 36 patients. In the non-insulin, we had 19 patients. In the insulin, we had 17. So the most common etiology in our patient was a chemical injury, and then we treated viral keratitis. Group A, that was a non-insulin, had 14 out of 19 reepithelialization, and Group B had 15 out of 17 reepithelialization. But it had a similar reepithelialization in both the groups.
Please conclude.
Yes, sir. And the
short of
duration was quite low in the insulin group. So these are some of the failures we saw in the insulin group, just one failure. And I just want to conclude that insulin was effective in treating NK at a faster rate, and NK can still progress to ocular surface perforation, so a better management and treatment is warranted. Thank you so much.
Dr. Abhishek, Dr. Binita, Dr. Roshan is here. जल्दी करिए 4 मिनट में. May I request, we are going to start our oration in auditorium. So just Dr. Roshan, I request just finish in 3 to 4 minutes.
Yes, sir. My topic is role of retinal laser in common retinal disease, no financial interest. To introduce, laser is an acronym for light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. So there are 3 modes of laser delivery. One is by operating microscope, one is indirect ophthalmoscope, and then slit lamp. So this is patterned laser, and this one is endo laser. This is indirect ophthalmoscope. These are 2 types of lenses, Vogue lenses and Menster lenses. These are various indications of retinal laser. This is diabetic retinopathy. This is post-PRP pics. And then these are various settings. In retinal vein occlusion, if there is neovascularization, we do laser. In CS shear, it is self-limiting. But if not responding, then we do FFA ICGA, and then FFA guided focal laser is done. And in neovascular glaucoma, we all know PRP is gold standard for the treatment of retinal ischemia. And for retinal breaks, we do Baraz laser. In diabetic macular edema, if it is parafoveal, then we do focal laser. In retinopathy of prematurity also, in type 1 ROP, we do retinal laser ablation. In traumatic subhaloid hemorrhage, we do posterior YAG halodotomy. And in polypoidal choroidal vasculopathy, if it is extrafoveal, peripapillary or peripheral, we ablate polyp. In ocular malignancy also, we do laser. So my take-home message in the current era of anti-VEGF, one of the disadvantages of anti-VEGF therapy is the burden of frequent injection, cost, and clinic visits. Laser treatment offers the advantage of a long-lasting effect compared to anti-VEGF therapy, so it should be optimized. Moreover, several studies have demonstrated that the combination of laser photocoagulation with anti-VEGF treatment has the potential to reduce the frequency of injections. However, it is important to note that the optimal timing and protocol for combining laser treatment with anti-VEGF injection has not been firmly established. Thank you so much for patient listening. Thank you, sir.
And very bad to say, sorry to say, कि not a single presenter is present here, either competitive section or non-competitive section, except you, the senior person, at 9 a.m. in the hall. So all the best, all of you. Future बहुत अच्छा है.